A middle-aged man sits before a camera, his demeanor eerily composed as he addresses each question posed by the investigators. There is no trace of fear, no hint of anxiety in his expression. In fact, at intervals, a self-satisfied smirk seems to materialize on his lips. His name is Jeffrey Epstein, a millionaire who operated within the world of high finance. Yet, that is not the legacy for which he is remembered. Instead, the world knows him as a criminal figure, implicated in the trafficking and systemic abuse of women. He was a man who leveraged his sprawling network of political and legal connections to evade justice, a man utterly devoid of remorse, a monster whose name alone would send a chill across the globe. It is hardly surprising, then, that his face tightens with a flicker of anger as authorities relentlessly question him about his alleged acts of harassment and even the trafficking and bartering of young women for the pleasure of high-ranking officials. We now turn to the evidence that brought this dark world into the light. Toward the end of this past January, the United States Department of Justice unsealed an archive of more than 3 million pages of documents, all tied to the investigation and prosecution of Jeffrey Epstein. Contained within was a roster of names that sent shockwaves through the public. Figures such as President Donald Trump, former President Bill Clinton, billionaire Elon Musk, numerous members of the British royal family, and a seemingly endless list of entrepreneurs, academics, and celebrities. All of them, to varying degrees, were linked to Jeffrey Epstein and the depraved gatherings he orchestrated at his properties around the globe. We will now delve into a chapter of Jeffrey Epstein's life, examining the accusations leveled against him to understand how a man engaged in such sordid activities could genuinely believe he stood above the law. And ultimately, we are forced to ask, are we living in a society so decadent, so pathological, that even the most monstrous of crimes can be concealed by the sheer weight of money and power? If one were to search for a word to define Jeffrey Epstein, enigmatic would be a profound understatement. He was often described in terms reminiscent of Gatsby, a mysterious fixture of New York City society. A bachelor, immensely wealthy, handsome, and undeniably alluring, he possessed a distinct and unconventional handsomeness. Yet, almost no one had any concrete information about Epstein's actual business dealings. It was only known that he made money vast, staggering sums of it by managing the financial affairs of the world's billionaires. Beyond his wealth, Epstein cultivated intimate relationships with figures like Prince Andrew of the British royal family, former President Bill Clinton, President Donald Trump, and the lawyer Alan Dershowitz, a renowned scholar celebrated for his work on the United States Constitution and criminal law. It is hardly surprising, then, that hundreds, perhaps even thousands, of young women constantly sought to enter his orbit. And Epstein himself made no secret of the pleasure he took in being the object of such adoration, even though it was common knowledge at the time that Ghislaine Maxwell was his girlfriend. And yet, the press was invariably, and one must stress, invariably photographing him in the company of beautiful young women, women who were scarcely older than his own children might have been. As we have noted, for many years, the true nature of Jeffrey Epstein remained an enigma, but the facade of this depraved millionaire began to crumble after an act of harassment against a young woman. Her name was Maria Farmer, and speaking before a camera, her voice was thick with emotion. In 1995, on the cusp of her graduation from the New York Academy of Art, Maria was preparing 3 paintings for her final graduate exhibition. Her work, titled Alice in Wonderland, quickly garnered significant acclaim from those who saw it. Several patrons of the arts offered to purchase the pieces, with prices ranging from $12,000 to $14,000 for each canvas, leaving Maria ecstatic. That was, until the dean, the man overseeing the exhibition, approached Maria and insisted that she sell all 3 paintings to a specific couple, 2 individuals described as significant benefactors of the school. And, as you may have already surmised, that couple was none other than Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. And so, from an asking price of $14,000, Maria was coerced into selling her triptych of artworks for a mere $6,000 per piece, with Epstein promising that he would make them truly valuable. Several months passed before Maria received a telephone call from Epstein. He told her he had a job for her, though it had nothing to do with her art. Epstein had recently purchased a new mansion on New York's 71st Street, and he wanted Maria to act as a gatekeeper, managing the constant flow of people coming and going each day. Despite it being unrelated to her field of study, the work was presented as simple and the pay was quite generous, so Maria accepted the offer. Then, one day, Epstein inquired about Maria's family, asking how many siblings she had. He learned that Maria had 2 younger sisters. One of them, Annie, who was several years Maria's junior, dreamed of attending an Ivy League school, one of the most prestigious private universities in America. Annie was only 16 years old at the time, and if Maria had been perceptive enough to recognize the flicker of perverse delight that crossed Epstein's face at that moment, perhaps she would never have introduced her younger sister to him. As a way of acquainting himself with Annie, Epstein proposed that he could help her secure an internship abroad to bolster her application portfolio. He made it clear, of course, that he would cover all expenses, and Annie, seeing a golden opportunity, quickly accepted. Epstein's real estate portfolio was not confined to New York. It was a sprawling empire that stretched across the globe. He owned a massive estate in Palm Beach, Florida, as well as 2 private islands in the U.S. Virgin Islands. His holdings included a sprawling 10,000-acre ranch in New Mexico and a lavish apartment in Paris, France. It was, therefore, not unusual for him to frequently invite associates and guests to his various properties. To any outsider, an invitation from such a man would seem like the opportunity of a lifetime. But when Annie finally set foot on the Zorro Ranch in New Mexico, a chilling realization dawned on her. The promised gathering was a fiction. Here, in this remote expanse, there were no other students, only her, Epstein, and Maxwell. Initially, their hospitality seemed genuine, almost disarming. But the atmosphere shifted the moment Maxwell posed an unsettling question. Had Annie ever experienced a truly high-end massage? It was then that the first threads of a dark reality began to unravel. Almost from the moment the session began, Maxwell repeatedly manipulated the towel covering Annie, deliberately exposing sensitive parts of her body. Annie was acutely aware that Epstein could be observing them, yet the 16-year-old girl, paralyzed by confusion, knew of nothing to do but lie motionless and endure it. Then, in the dark hours before morning, Epstein slipped into Annie's room, saying he wanted to hold her, and then proceeded to commit acts that defy imagination. The terror sealed her lips. She told no one, burying the trauma and focusing only on an upcoming summer trip abroad, a desperate means of escape. After Annie departed, Epstein shifted his focus to her sister, Maria, reaching out with a feigned desire to support her career as a painter. He made a dazzling offer. She could become the artist in residence at his grand estate in the city of New Albany, Ohio. From the very beginning, Maria's artwork was a delicate exploration of adolescence, capturing private moments with a profound innocence, entirely devoid of vulgarity. To achieve the most striking and authentic results, Maria would photograph her own sisters in their private spaces, later transposing those candid images onto canvas. One evening, under the pretense of a social visit, Maxwell called Maria into a room, explaining that Stein wished for her to give him a foot massage. Operating from a place of gratitude and not wanting to cause offense, Maria awkwardly began the massage when he suddenly instructed her to get on the bed and sit with him and Maxwell. Almost instantaneously, both men began to put their hands on Maria's body. And then, the inevitable happened. After the two had departed the following morning, Maria discovered that the photographs of her sisters had vanished. At the time, Annie was only 16 years old, while their youngest sister had just turned 12. The question that hung in the air was as simple as it was sickening. For what purpose would a middle-aged man steal photographs of young girls? In a frantic call to confront Annie, Maria finally learned the full extent of what her younger sister had been forced to endure. Naturally, their anger was eclipsed only by their terror. And who wouldn't be terrified? They were acutely aware of the men's vast network of connections, of their immense political power. Yet, they could not simply turn a blind eye. So when Stein called Maria, she excoriated him. "So what do you want to keep this from becoming a scene?" His voice was laced with indifference. He was a man who believed money could silence anything. Realizing she was speaking to a depraved mind, Maria ended the call. Upon returning to New York, she took the matter to the authorities. The police asserted that because the incident occurred in Ohio, it fell outside their jurisdiction, advising Maria to contact the FBI. The FBI initially displayed a significant interest in her story, but as time stretched on, it became painfully clear to Maria and Annie that no help was forthcoming. 7 years later, in the year 2003, Maria and Annie, urged on by their family, decided to recount their story, though they did so with extreme reluctance. As mentioned, Stein commanded a terrifying level of power. And besides, who would ever believe them? Vicky W., an investigative journalist and an editor at Vanity Fair, did not share that sentiment. She declared that the time had come to expose Stein's true face, and that Vanity Fair would be the publication to do it. Predictably, Stein denied all allegations. From his perspective, the young Maria was infatuated with him and had fabricated the story as an act of revenge for unrequited feelings. In a concurrent move, he reached out to Vicky with a threat. He stated that if the article she wrote caused him any discomfort, he would harm her entire family, adding that the unborn child in her womb would find it very difficult to be born. As for Graydon Carter, the editor-in-chief of Vanity Fair, He too was gripped by fear upon finding a severed cat's head and a single bullet in his garden. With unnerving suddenness, he commanded Vicky to halt her work. Only a few days later, the article about Epstein was published. However, it was not an exposé designed to unmask a predator, but rather a glowing piece of praise. Graydon Carter publicly emphasized his belief in Epstein, explaining that Vicky's investigation was suspended because it lacked legal suitability. That was merely the first account among a vast number of corrupt tales surrounding the powerful millionaire. But this was only the visible tip of the iceberg. The events that unfolded in Florida, at the estate in Palm Beach, would send a shiver of pure dread through the world. According to Khan Hassan, the Palm Beach mansion was acquired by Epstein in 1990. For all intents and purposes, the estate was a modern-day fortress for the super-rich. They had their own private security, 24/7 surveillance cameras, and a sophisticated intruder alert system. It would be no exaggeration to say its seclusion, privacy, and hermetic nature offered the perfect environment for a millionaire pursuing indecent activities. Epstein's neighbors paid him little attention. This was partly due to the insular nature of the community, and partly because almost no one knew who Jeffrey Epstein truly was. They were aware only that he was immensely wealthy, living a life that most could only dream of, possessing real estate in numerous locations, a private jet, a personal helicopter, and a reputation for being generous. Somehow, the most powerful figures in America were drawn to him, entrusting him to manage their money. Donald Trump himself was notably close with Epstein. They lived a mere mile from each other along Palm Beach's Billionaires Row. During the early 1990s, images of the future United States president consorting with Stein were a frequent sight. Trump even told the press he had known Epstein for 15 years and that he was a terrific guy, noting that they shared a common interest in beautiful women. In an effort to ingratiate himself with the regional police department, on occasion, Epstein would make an appearance at the police department. Back in 2001, shortly after Michael Ryder was appointed chief of police, Epstein paid him a visit. He expressed a desire to donate an array of modern equipment to the department, a contribution valued at nearly $100,000. Ryder would later describe the encounter as remarkably brief. Nevertheless, Epstein left a distinct impression on the police chief, presenting himself as a man who was both intelligent and intensely private. Nearly 2 years later, neighbors living near Epstein's residence began reporting a steady stream of young women coming and going from the house throughout the day. When officers were dispatched to investigate, they found that the women were all over the age of 18, which gave the police little cause for official concern. Fast forward to the year 2005. One day, a call came into Michael Ryder's office from a deeply concerned family. According to the mother, her daughter, who was just over 14 years old at the time, had been involved in a fight at school. The incident itself was minor, but one detail was profoundly unsettling. The girl was carrying over $300 in cash. Under questioning from her parents, who knew the money wasn't from them, the girl confessed she had earned it by giving massages to a man at his mansion. Stunned by this revelation, Chief Ryder summoned the family to the station to provide a formal statement and immediately transferred the case to a special investigations unit. Officer Joe Riccari was one of the investigators directly assigned to the case. Within a matter of weeks, he uncovered that it was not just one girl, but dozens of others who had also given massages, prompting him to reach out and invite them in to talk. The emerging pattern was chilling. Epstein's victims typically ranged in age from 14 or even younger up to 17 years old. Their stories all began the same way: an appointment at the mansion for what they believed was a simple massage job with a promised payment of $200. The arrangement, however, would invariably pivot. Mid-session, Epstein would demand they disrobe before proceeding to frantically gratify himself in their presence. Grasping the gravity of the accumulating accounts, law enforcement initiated tight surveillance on Epstein's properties, his vehicles, and his private aircraft. Simultaneously, the list of victims was expanding at an alarming rate, a relentless surge that stunned investigators. Among them was a young woman named Michelle Licata. There was a time when Michelle's life seemed idyllic. She was an excellent student, the captain of her cheerleading squad, and surrounded by friends, the kind of girl who could never imagine that such a horrifying fate awaited her. It happened during the holiday season. Michelle was looking to earn a little extra money for Christmas when a friend told her about an easy job, providing massages for a wealthy man. While the proposition felt odd, the allure of earning $200 for just 45 minutes of work was too powerful for the 16-year-old to ignore, and any reservations were quickly dismissed. Then, Epstein entered the room. He requested the massage begin, his words laced with compliments about her beauty. The flattery, of course, was merely a prelude to his true, calculated intentions. As with, the central question that emerges is a chilling one. Why, knowing the profound wrongness of the act, did they still comply with the billionaire's demands? Picture this. A 16-year-old girl, naive and with scarcely any experience of the world, is suddenly thrust into an entirely alien environment, where she is confronted by an immensely powerful figure on his own fortified territory, a place bristling with security personnel and surveillance cameras. The presence of fear in such a situation is an undeniable certainty. 100 terrifying scenarios must have raced through their minds. What if they resisted? What if they disobeyed? Would he turn violent? Later, police indictments would paint a picture of a master manipulator, someone exceptionally skilled at psychological coercion. And by all accounts, this assessment appears to be chillingly accurate. Almost no one ever dared to defy him or push back against his will. The internal monologue was often the same, a desperate mantra. All right, just close your eyes, get through this, and then never, ever return. But was it ever truly over? The events of that day rarely stayed in the past. Instead, the terror morphed into a persistent phantom, haunting these young women for the rest of their lives. So profound was the trauma that even years later, the mere memory could induce a physical tremor. Observing his methods closely reveals a predatory formula. Epstein consistently targeted the vulnerable, preying on those in desperate need of money. For contrary to popular belief, Palm Beach is not uniformly affluent. A mere 30-minute drive west, across the bridge toward the mainland, takes you to West Palm, a world away, a community of the working poor. It was here that another of Epstein's victims, a young woman named Shanna Rivera, once lived. Her story stands in stark contrast to that of Michelle Licata, who came from a loving, supportive family and received a proper education. Shanna's life, however, was marked by hardship, having been born into a deeply troubled home. But Shanna's path to Epstein was different. She didn't actively seek him out in search of money. To be precise, she was deceived, lured into the monster's den. At the age of 14, a friend claimed she desperately needed to visit Epstein's residence, but was too frightened to go by herself, pleading for Shanna to accompany her. The moment she crossed the threshold into the immense mansion, an unnerving feeling washed over Shanna. Something was deeply wrong. The first red flag was her friend's unsettlingly familiar demeanor with Epstein's staff, an ease that suggested she had been a frequent visitor. And then, as Epstein entered the room, her friend turned to her with a chilling request to give him a massage, completely unclothed. Abruptly, the friend stood, announced she would be waiting outside, and abandoned Shanna in the room. From here, the depravity that would unfold requires little imagination. Epstein would go on to coerce Shanna into acts that defy polite description, and yet, for reasons known only to him, he developed a particular interest in her. Aware of her poverty, he summoned her to his mansion on no fewer than 5 occasions, sending a taxi to fetch her. Each visit concluded with her receiving $200. Victims like Shanna found themselves trapped in a vicious, inescapable cycle. They yearned for a way out, but their circumstances made them dependent on their tormentor. They were repulsed by him, yet paralyzed by a potent mixture of fear and shame that silenced them from speaking out. This was the very engine that powered his depraved enterprise. As has been established, the vast majority of his victims were vulnerable individuals, grappling with financial hardship or bearing the scars of childhood trauma. Once a target was selected, he would meticulously excavate her past, searching for the precise vulnerabilities that would allow him to cultivate a deep, unshakable dependency. Their innocence, their sheer lack of worldly experience, became the very fault line he was engineered to exploit. And so, when investigators finally arrived, they encountered a wall of silence. Most of the victims refused to press charges, paralyzed by the fear of retaliation. Recognizing this psychological hold, police made repeated attempts to contact his drivers, bodyguards, or anyone from his inner circle, but every inquiry was met with an unyielding refusal to cooperate. With all other avenues exhausted, they resorted to sifting through Epstein's trash, hoping to uncover even the smallest clue. Sometimes they would find the report card of a female student from a nearby high school. Other times, a list of girls to whom Epstein wanted his driver to deliver flowers, celebrating a performance or a graduation. West Palm Beach was home to dozens of high schools, and based on these discoveries, investigators began to fear the number of victims could swell into the hundreds, perhaps even thousands. The critical question remained: how were these victims being delivered to Epstein? In Shanna's story, we see she was brought to Epstein's home by a friend, and that friend was just one of many who played the same role. Harley Robson first crossed paths with Epstein when she was 16 years old. Like so many others, Harley had been lured to Epstein's residence with the promise of a ticket out of a life of struggle and poverty. Yet, the moment he attempted to touch her, she recoiled. After a moment's pause, Epstein simply smiled and presented an alternative. Harley could earn money by procuring other girls for him. It was a simple proposition, he explained, and she would receive $200 for each one. Over the course of the next year, Harley would introduce 24 girls to Epstein, a fact that would later place her on a special police list for her role as an accomplice to his crimes. After 7 months of investigation, Police Chief Michael Reiter came to a stark conclusion. They would never be able to bring Epstein down without a full search of his residence. They had to proceed with extreme caution. If word of the raid leaked, Epstein could easily destroy the evidence, completely rewriting the narrative. Finally, on the 20th of October, 2005, police executed a court-ordered search warrant on Epstein's home. The moment they stepped inside, the details described by numerous victims clicked into place. From the hallways and staircases to the massage room, everything matched. Investigators were also stunned by the sheer volume of nude paintings and statues displayed throughout the home. But Epstein had already sanitized the scene, erasing any evidence that could incriminate him. All the computers were missing their hard drives, the surveillance cameras had no tapes, and the household staff were as silent as stone. The implication was chilling. Someone inside the police department must have tipped him off, warning that they were about to raid his Palm Beach mansion. Still, other clues had been left behind, like call logs and hastily written recruitment lists of young women. But if they were going to make the charges stick, the investigators knew they had a long road ahead to build an ironclad case. First, they needed to maintain absolute secrecy, preventing any information from leaking to anyone outside the investigation. The police also had to filter through the many victims who were unwilling to prosecute and establish a protected witness list. Before we delve deeper into the indictment and the disturbingly long list of Jeffrey Epstein's victims, we need to journey back in time, years earlier, to understand who Jeffrey Epstein truly was and where this man came from. He was born on the 20th of May, 1953, in Coney Island, New York, to what could be described as an unremarkable, middle-class family. During his school years, he was a member of the math club. And while he wasn't considered a prodigious genius, he graduated several years ahead of his peers and went on to major in physics at Cooper Union. Just 2 years later, Epstein dropped out and transferred to the Courant Institute of Mathematical Sciences at New York University. However, after 3 years there, he left as well. Jeffrey Epstein never earned a college degree in his life, and yet, somehow, he was hired as a math teacher at Dalton, an incredibly prestigious private school in New York. Unsurprisingly, it wasn't long before he was let go. Fired for his lack of professional qualifications, he had nevertheless been there long enough to forge powerful connections. To this day, it remains a mystery how a teacher with no degree, accused of inappropriate behavior for encouraging students to drink and for having questionable relationships with female students, managed to connect with Alan Greenberg, the CEO of Bear Stearns. Could the simple fact that both of Alan's children attended Dalton truly explain how he befriended a man of such immense power and influence? Regardless of how it happened, after his dismissal from the school in 1976, Epstein began working at Bear Stearns, under the personal recommendation of Alan Greenberg. Initially, Michael Tenenbaum, a senior managing director at Bear Stearns, was perplexed when Greenberg introduced Epstein to him. Contrary to everyone's skepticism, however, Epstein demonstrated a remarkable aptitude for business. And so, after a few interviews, he was hired to develop and analyze markets for the firm. Epstein's sharp instincts impressed everyone around him. But just 2 months later, they discovered he had lied on his resume. None of the universities Epstein listed had any record of him, prompting Alan Greenberg to leave the final decision in Michael Tenenbaum's hands. Yet, the decision to fire Epstein was swiftly reversed when he confessed to falsifying his CV, expressing an almost desperate hunger to make money. It was the kind of rapacious hunger so familiar on Wall Street in that era, the instinct of an old fox. It was therefore no surprise when Michael relented, keeping Epstein on staff until, several years later, he was inevitably dismissed for rule violations. After his departure from Bear Stearns, Epstein founded his own firm, a company he named the Intercontinental Access Group. Its stated purpose was to assist clients in recovering money stolen by unscrupulous brokers and lawyers in sordid backroom dealings. This was the period when Epstein's path crossed with Stephen Hoffenberg's a meeting that led to Hoffenberg hiring him as a consultant for Towers Financial Corporation. It was through Hoffenberg that the next chapter of his dark enterprise began. Epstein proceeded to defraud and embezzle vast sums of money from the corporation. At its core, Towers Financial was a debt recovery agency. By acquiring portfolios of delinquent debt, the company managed to entice a significant number of investors. A retrospective look at the entire operation of Towers Financial Corporation reveals the unmistakable structure of a massive Ponzi scheme. And it was here that the true problem festered. According to Hoffenberg, Epstein possessed an aura of unshakable trustworthiness. He could manipulate people with remarkable ease, a skill that allowed him to profit immensely from his deceptions. When Hoffenberg was indicted for fraud in 1993 and subsequently sentenced to 20 years in prison, Jeffrey Epstein faced no prosecution whatsoever. Hoffenberg himself offered no evidence against his former associate, later claiming that Epstein had told him he was a cooperating witness for the United States Department of Justice. This remains a deeply perplexing and difficult point to reconcile. How one man could so easily deceive everyone around him, leaving them to face severe consequences while he walked away unscathed. But that was far from the end of the story. In 1986, Epstein met Les Wexner, an immensely wealthy billionaire. Wexner was the very embodiment of persistence, tenacity, and hard work. He had built his empire from the ground up, starting in 1963 with a single women's apparel store called The Limited. After navigating treacherous business landscapes, Wexner acquired various fashion labels, including Abercrombie & Fitch and Victoria's Secret, transforming them into global powerhouses. It is, therefore, a profound mystery how such a brilliant, cautious, and notoriously distrustful man like Wexner could place his absolute faith in Jeffrey Epstein, a man with no college degree, fired twice for rule violations, and deeply enmeshed in fraudulent activities, and then entrust him with the management of his personal fortune. And it wasn't just Hoffenberg or Wexner. A significant number of successful entrepreneurs, millionaires, and billionaires in the late 1980s and early 1990s counted Epstein among their friends. On one rare occasion, Epstein confided in Hoffenberg, boasting that he could effortlessly control Wexner's emotions and manipulate him. In other words, Wexner was utterly captivated, almost to the point of adoration. This very dynamic is why, in numerous subsequent hearings before law enforcement, Epstein was repeatedly questioned about the nature of his relationship with Wexner, whether it extended beyond business, and how he managed to wield such profound influence over him. Between 1991 and 2006, Epstein oversaw the sale of more than $1.3 billion in stock from Wexner's companies. Much later, in 2019, Wexner would reveal that he had severed all ties with Epstein in mid-2007 upon discovering the theft of more than $46 million of his own money. And yet, inexplicably, no lawsuit was ever filed, and Wexner offered no further explanation. During the years of their close association, Epstein routinely leveraged his status as Wexner's confidant to recruit young women into his circle. He would claim he was scouting new talent for Victoria's Secret on Wexner's behalf. Alicia Arden was one of the young women who fell for this ruse. Lying in wait at the Shutters Hotel in Santa Monica, California, the moment Alicia stepped into the room, Epstein demanded she undress. Fearing the worst, Alicia fled directly to the police station to file a report, but in the end, no action was taken. Returning to 2006, the investigation into Jeffrey Epstein had, for all intents and purposes, reached a stalemate. The police were forced to bring in seasoned detectives, experts at unearthing buried truths. Mike Fincannon, a man with 2 daughters around the same age as the victims, took a profound personal interest in the case. Within a remarkably short period, he had identified 46 different victims connected to Epstein. Many of them were unwilling to cooperate. They feared Epstein's power, and it was a fear well-founded. It wasn't just the victims who felt the pressure. Even Police Chief Michael Ryder and Officer Joe Riccieri noticed unidentified men loitering near their homes. Private investigators hired by Epstein would park across the street, shining their headlights into a victim's bedroom all night long, unafraid even when Detective Fincannon himself appeared to photograph and film their intimidation tactics. The situation became so untenable that Fincannon was forced to move multiple victims to the safety of a hotel. The grim irony was that they were being terrorized by the very man who should have been locked away for good. Then, in November of 2007, the FBI began to collaborate with the U.S. Attorney's Office. Though they weren't direct partners in the investigation, FBI agents contacted Chief Michael Ryder, who provided them with his list of victims. There was a sense that Epstein's time was finally running out. The case was bolstered by 35 to 40 witnesses prepared to testify in court, all supported by a 53-page indictment. The prosecutor assigned to the case at the time was Alex Acosta. Yet, contrary to Acosta's promises to bring every one of Epstein's skeletons out of the closet, the case would take a very different turn. 2 years later, the truth became chillingly clear. They had all been deceived. Once the case file was handed over to the federal government, a profound and unnerving silence descended upon the investigation. It was Mary Villafana, an assistant prosecutor, who first signaled the rot beneath the surface in a phone call to Brad Edwards, the attorney representing the victims. She confessed her bewilderment, stating that deeply irregular things were happening, things she couldn't dare articulate over an open line. Then, abruptly, a wall of silence was erected. The entire contingent of FBI agents on the case reported they had been gagged, strictly forbidden from any further communication with the Palm Beach Police Department. And then, the inevitable blow fell. Alex Acosta announced that all charges were being summarily dismissed, and the FBI was ordered to stand down, its investigation terminated. A wave of fury rippled not only through the victim's camp but also through the ranks of the very FBI agents who had worked the case. Agent Curray Candle, the man who had relentlessly pursued the investigation, reportedly broke down in tears when Mike Fiston called to check on him. No one could fathom why the U.S. attorney would shut down the case, and a coordinated wall of silence met every inquiry. They universally refused interviews, offering no concrete explanation. Only later, as investigators dug deeper into the abyss of the Epstein affair, did the truth emerge. Through a vast network of wealth and influence, Epstein had assembled nothing short of a legal dream team to shield him. This roster included 8 of America's most formidable legal minds, among them former United States Solicitor General Kenneth Starr, attorney Roy Black, who had taught criminal law at the University of Miami, and Jay Lefkowitz, a former director of cabinet affairs and deputy executive secretary of the Domestic Policy Council. The list even included Alan Dershowitz, a celebrated Harvard law professor once hailed by New York Magazine as one of America's finest defense attorneys. By Alan Dershowitz's own account, his relationship with Epstein was not merely professional, they were exceptionally close friends. So close, in fact, that when Dershowitz authored a book on legal matters, the very first manuscript was sent to Epstein. It was hardly surprising then that when the first witness emerged, Epstein's call for help went directly to Allen, and here, these brilliant legal minds began to deploy their formidable talents. Through a battery of calculated maneuvers, they meticulously orchestrated a public narrative that painted the witnesses as fundamentally untrustworthy, weaponizing their troubled pasts to discredit them. Simultaneously, Dershowitz's team began digging into the personal lives of the investigating officers, searching for any vulnerability they could exploit. This explains the unsettling reports of private investigators staking out the homes of Police Chief Michael Reiter and Officer Kane Ruqui. Suddenly, a pattern of otherwise inexplicable events began to make a chilling kind of sense. Consider the events of 2006. Nearly all key witnesses suddenly retracted their statements after receiving financial settlements from Epstein's camp. He, in turn, was detained for a mere matter of hours after being charged with soliciting individuals for illicit sexual activities. In essence, it became clear that Epstein's lawyers were interrogating the victims through a variety of deeply psychological methods. According to reports, many were subjected to morally corrosive lines of questioning, such as being asked to decide which was worse, terminating 3 pregnancies or giving a massage to Epstein. Such a question, of course, had absolutely no bearing on the crimes Epstein was alleged to have committed, but his legal team understood a brutal psychological truth. By constantly reopening old wounds, applying relentless pressure, and protracting the legal proceedings, most victims would eventually reach a breaking point. They would either abandon their fight for justice or accept a meager settlement, forever silenced by a non-disclosure agreement. In other words, Alan Dershowitz and his colleagues engaged in a calculated campaign to expose every negative aspect of the young women's lives, steering public perception toward doubting their credibility by virtue of their less than pristine backgrounds. Everyone recognized this for what it was, a grotesque injustice, a mockery of the very legal loopholes that the architects of the law were now systematically exploiting. For the victims, the ordeal extended far beyond the courtroom and the psychological warfare waged by the legal team. They were also subjected to a campaign of defamation, along with threats that targeted not only their careers, but their very lives. For instance, Maria Farmer received a menacing phone call from Epstein's former girlfriend, Ghislaine Maxwell, who allegedly threatened to burn all of Farmer's paintings and obliterate her future, making it clear they knew where she lived and even the exact times of her daily runs. It was no exaggeration to say that if they continued to press the matter, the victims could simply vanish, as if they had never existed at all. It is little wonder, then, that for years Maria was forced to move constantly, but even that nomadic existence was not enough to feel safe. After nearly 2 years of federal silence, something shifted. Suddenly, on June 30th, 2008, headlines exploded with the news that Epstein was scheduled to appear in court for reasons that remained completely opaque. The courtroom was packed, and it was in that moment that the victim's attorney sensed something was profoundly wrong. Then, with shocking abruptness, the hearing was over. By some unseen mechanism, Epstein's lawyers had brokered a deal with the U.S. Attorney's Office. He would accept an 18-month sentence at the Palm Beach County Jail for a lesser charge of solicitation not for sexual assault or procuring individuals for illicit activities. Alex Acosta, in his capacity as the U.S. attorney, offered little in the way of explanation for this stunning turn of events. Everyone present was left utterly bewildered by the court's conclusion. The very case that should have seen Epstein face a minimum of 15 years in prison had been closed, adjudicated without ever having gone to trial. The press and the media were thrown into an uproar. A palpable sense of outrage permeated public discourse. The police and FBI agents were left with the profound feeling that they had failed to protect the very victims they had vowed to serve. As for Epstein, he was granted immunity from all federal charges, and not a single one of his accomplices was convicted. Many prosecutors were indignant, stating that in their 45 years of practice, they had never once witnessed a defendant enter into a plea agreement only to be granted immunity from the original indictment and receive an entirely different sentence. Yet Alan Dershowitz remained adamant, insisting that the outcome of the case had absolutely nothing to do with some backroom deal between government officials and a man of Epstein's immense wealth. Everything they had done, he claimed, was fully sanctioned by the U.S. Attorney's Office with Acosta at its helm. It was a document read and approved by the Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division in Washington, one that had been meticulously studied by the Deputy Attorney General and the Attorney General of the United States himself. In short, with a verdict sanctioned at such high levels, the official narrative insisted that nothing could possibly be amiss. And yet, he was far from satisfied. In fact, he was consumed by a cold rage directed at his own legal team. He believed they could have done better, infinitely better. During a rare interview granted to the press, a reporter named Rush questioned Epstein, asking if he agreed that his sentence was a sweetheart deal brokered behind closed doors with government officials. In response, Epstein dismissed the notion as absurd, claiming that any prison time at all was an excessively harsh punishment. He argued that for such an alleged offense in New York, the penalty would have been nothing more than a $100 fine. Furthermore, he asserted that the nature of the women who came to his home, implying they were escorts, was not his responsibility, rendering him entirely innocent. This claim was met with universal outrage, as no one believed for a moment that the young women visiting his residence fit that description. It would later be discovered that the U.S. Attorney's Office and Epstein's camp had exchanged a torrent of emails, forging a secret agreement completely concealed from the victims. To be precise, Epstein's time in jail was anything but standard. He was housed in a special wing, completely isolated from the general inmate population. His cell door remained unlocked 24/7. He had a television and was provided with his own food. For 6 out of 7 days a week, he was permitted to leave the prison grounds. And these were not brief excursions. He was granted a full 12 hours of outside leave each day, a fact Epstein brazenly admitted. Because if anyone dared to question the warden or the prison director, the answer was always disarmingly simple. He was a celebrity. This justification was a grotesque mockery of the law, which dictates that all prisoners must be treated equally. He received special dispensation, and upon his release, he immediately resumed a life of lavish parties, despite still being on probation. The police knew he was hiding in his vehicle. They compiled an 11-page report detailing the violation, but what power did it hold? If the man himself remained untouchable? We turn back the clock to 1999. A young woman named Virginia Jeffrey was working as an attendant in the spa locker room at Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago. At the time, her ambition was to become a licensed massage therapist. So when Ghislaine Maxwell approached her with an offer to become Epstein's personal therapist, one can only imagine Virginia's elation. During her first massage session with Epstein, he inquired about her background. Having grown up in hardship, Virginia opened up, sharing that this was the most incredible opportunity she had ever been given. And then, as with so many others, the darkness began to creep in. The perversion started when he turned over, and it was far from the last time, not after Virginia accepted a full-time position as his dedicated therapist. Ghislaine Maxwell had made a promise. Virginia would travel the world and meet famous people. It was a promise she intended to keep. It's crucial to understand that Epstein and his girlfriend were masters of normalization, skillfully disguising their depraved activities under the veneer of legitimate employment. For Virginia, it became a terrifying, inescapable cycle, transforming her into a slave to be trafficked, bartered, and loaned out. The men Virginia was forced to encounter were a roll call of the powerful: politicians, titans of business, and even celebrated actors. Virginia Jeffrey was just one of many. Back in 2006, Sarah Ransome was trafficked by Epstein to the elite for the very same purposes. At 22 years old, she arrived in New York, chasing the shimmering American dream. 2 weeks later, while at a nightclub with a friend, Sarah was approached by a woman named Natalia Malyshev. Natalia immediately claimed to know someone who could change Sarah's life, both financially and professionally, an incredibly kind and generous philanthropist. Intrigued by this narrative, Sarah agreed to a meeting with Epstein. Her initial impression of him was overwhelmingly positive. Epstein was charming, attentive, and seemed to genuinely listen to her aspirations. And so, just a few days later, Natalia delivered the news. Epstein would pay for Sarah's entire college tuition. He also invited her to accompany him to his private island. At this point, you surely know the destination in question: Little St. James, an island that would become infamous under a much more sinister name, Pedophile Island. Just 30 minutes into the flight, Sarah witnessed a scene of profound strangeness. Epstein began to engage in intimate acts with another girl, roughly her own age, while the other passengers simply pretended to be asleep. From that moment on, Sarah's horrifying ordeal on the island began. Epstein would routinely summon the girls to his private room and subject them to the worst acts a man can inflict upon a woman. The more she struggled, the more she resisted, the more aroused and delighted Epstein seemed to become. There were moments when Sarah plotted her escape, contemplating a desperate swim into the open sea to signal a passing fishing boat. But escape was a near impossibility. The island was utterly isolated from the outside world, a fortress under constant surveillance. The slightest deviation from the expected, and the girls would be swiftly brought back under his control. It was an open secret among those on the island. Nearly every week, a new group of 5 to 6 young women would arrive. Epstein had populated the island with numerous small bungalows and guest houses. He frequently invited friends to join him for debaucherous parties. This island was, without a doubt, Epstein's personal playground. Steve Cawley, a man tasked with maintaining the island's telecommunications and data systems from 1999 through 2005, would later recount what he saw. On no fewer than 100 occasions, he witnessed nude young women dancing by the swimming pool, inside the guest houses, and along the shoreline. And the list of global figures, politicians, high-ranking officials, world-renowned businessmen was seemingly endless. Names like Alan Dershowitz, Bill Clinton, and even Prince Andrew of the United Kingdom were all part of this circle. And, invariably, each of these powerful men found themselves in the company of beautiful and disturbingly young women on more than one occasion. What truly horrified Steve was observing how these officials would descend upon the girls, consuming them without a shred of mercy, like a pack of ravenous beasts that had been starved for days. Like nearly every other staff member, Steve was bound by stringent non-disclosure agreements, sworn to a code of absolute silence. Few wanted any connection to the sordid activities taking place, so they completed their duties and departed the island as quickly as humanly possible. Then one day, a guest of considerable influence casually asked Steve why he never brought his own daughters, who were merely 13 and 15 years old, to the island for a visit. It was in that chilling moment that Steve knew he had to resign, to flee this place. No father, he realized, would ever want his children anywhere near that island, anywhere near Epstein, or anywhere near his predatory circle of friends. They would have put 1,000 miles between themselves and that world if they could, but everyone understood the terrifying truth. The power wielded by these men was immense, enough to shape the very course of global events. Shang Davis first crossed paths with Epstein when she was just 21 years old, working as his personal massage therapist. An invitation to the island soon followed. Like so many others before her, Shang became another one of his victims. But her ordeal was far from over. In the year 2001, on a flight from Los Angeles to New York, she was taken aback by the presence of Bill Clinton, Kevin Spacey, and Chris Tucker. Shang's most devastating mistake, however, was introducing her own younger sister to Epstein after the girl confided in her about her dreams of a better education. With the alluring promise of funding her entire tuition at a private language school in Spain, Epstein instead plunged the young girl's life into a living nightmare. It became clear that his network extended far beyond government officials, ensnaring anyone of note. Figures like the director Woody Allen and a host of other celebrated actors were all connected to Epstein, and the list of his victims continued to grow ever longer. Publicly, Epstein was also known for his lavish donations, generously funding numerous charitable foundations. He assembled a stable of renowned scientists, sponsoring their programs in a calculated effort to launder his tarnished reputation. Yet behind this facade, there was no sign of remorse, no flicker of regret or guilt for the lives he had destroyed. He remained utterly indifferent to the persistent psychological trauma that haunted his victims day after day. For them, escape was the only thought, and they seized any opportunity to flee. Sarah managed to escape to Spain, while Virginia fled to Thailand. Her desperate flight came immediately after Epstein and his girlfriend made a horrifying proposition. He wanted a child, and she was to be his surrogate. Seizing a rare opportunity to study for a massage certification abroad, Virginia finally managed to sever all ties with Epstein. It was during this time that she met the man who would become her husband. They fell deeply in love and were soon married in a small, nearby temple. Upon learning of the marriage, Epstein was reportedly consumed with rage, and in that moment, Virginia knew she had to fight back to reclaim the freedom that had been stolen from her for so long. According to Virginia's testimony, her first encounter with Prince Andrew took place on the 10th of May, 2001, at the London home of Ghislaine Maxwell. Virginia was only 17 years old at the time. She had a camera with her and took a souvenir photo with Prince Andrew. Immediately after, she was instructed to service him. Unsurprisingly, both Maxwell and Prince Andrew have vehemently and consistently denied these allegations. The British royal family, in turn, launched a campaign to discredit her, labeling Virginia a prostitute, a liar, and assailing her with other horrific invectives. It was a clear attempt to manipulate public opinion in their favor, culminating in an unequivocal statement from Buckingham Palace, rejecting any notion that the Duke of York had engaged in any form of relationship with Virginia Roberts. Following an investigation, Virginia's legal counsel asserted that she had been sold and trafficked to Epstein's friends on at least 30 separate occasions, all before she had reached the age of 18. This is where the situation grew even more complicated, as one of the men Virginia identified was the prominent lawyer, Alan Dershowitz. The attorney, a man with a famously self-righteous demeanor, loudly denounced Virginia and challenged her to repeat her accusations directly into a camera, just as he had done with his denials. And Virginia did exactly that. After all, she had nothing to be afraid of. The truth, no matter how grotesque or sordid, remains the truth. To this day, Virginia and Alan Dershowitz remain locked in a bitter legal battle, exchanging lawsuits for defamation and slander. This intensified in 2016 during the presidential election between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. It was a source of profound outrage not only for Sarah Ransome, but for most of the victims, given that both candidates had well-documented, close connections to Jeffrey Epstein. Determined to expose what she saw as their true nature, Sarah approached nearly every major news network in the United States and the United Kingdom to share her story, but her pleas for attention were met with indifference. It wasn't until 2017, when the Me Too movement erupted across social media, that the victims finally found an opportunity to make their voices heard. Propelled by the momentum of this movement, a wave of journalists began publishing investigative series exploring the connection between Alex Acosta, the sitting Secretary of Labor, and the secret plea deal he had orchestrated in the Epstein case years earlier. November 28, 2018, marked a pivotal moment when the Miami Herald published an exhaustive report that re-examined the original 2008 allegations. Finally, in 2019, Judge Mehra delivered a landmark ruling. The federal government had conspired with Jeffrey Epstein, violating both the law and the fundamental rights of his victims. The implication was staggering. Epstein's case would be reopened and brought to trial once more. The ruling also sharply criticized the federal government under Alex Acosta's leadership for deceiving the relevant parties and mandated a new hearing where the victims would finally have the right to voice their opposition to that deal. For the survivors, after so many years of silence and injustice, it was a profound moment of vindication. As the wheels of justice finally began to turn, the FBI reconnected with numerous victims, seeking additional evidence and testimony to fortify the case against him. Then, on the 6th of July, 2019, Jeffrey Epstein was formally taken into custody at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey, arrested the moment his private jet touched down, facing a battery of grave allegations. 2 days later, his court appearance became a media firestorm. A large placard declared the case as the United States versus Jeffrey Epstein, framed as a pivotal moment for the Department of Justice to reclaim the public's trust. Officials asserted that Jeffrey Epstein would face the full force of the law, a trial intended to deliver justice for every last one of his victims. A wave of relief swept through the public. It was a moment of catharsis. They had waited so long, far too long, for a chance at justice. When FBI agents breached his 7-story, $77 million mansion on Manhattan's Upper East Side, they uncovered a horrifying archive, hundreds of thousands of nude photographs, videotapes, and extensive call logs. The discovery sent a shockwave of horror through the public. For the victims, a new terror emerged. Were there images in that collection? Had Epstein shared them with his associates? And what, exactly, had he done with that cache of material? In the aftermath, his powerful acquaintances began to frantically distance themselves, vehemently denying any close ties or friendships. Then President Donald Trump announced to the press that he and Epstein had suffered a falling out years prior. He claimed that for 15 years, there had been no communication between them whatsoever. Bill Clinton also issued a statement, asserting that he'd had no contact with Epstein in over a decade and had never visited his private island or any of his other vacation properties. Yet, the flight logs recovered by the FBI told a starkly different story. According to their records, Bill Clinton flew with Epstein on private aircraft no fewer than 26 times between 2001 and 2003. During a televised interview with the BBC, Prince Andrew would also categorically deny any connection to Virginia. That brazen audacity eroded all public trust, for there was not a single trace of remorse in the way he recounted his version of events. By simply responding with, "I don't remember," "I don't know, and I'm not acquainted with her," Prince Andrew exposed a profoundly different face of the elite, a visage of cowardice, corruption, decay, and filth. In an effort to construct a viable alibi, Prince Andrew claimed that on the night the photograph with Virginia was taken, he was at a pizza parlor with his daughter. But when investigators cross-referenced his story with Steve Colley, a telecommunications maintenance worker on the island, a conflicting account emerged. Colley confirmed seeing the prince visit the island on multiple occasions and, furthermore, identified Virginia as one of the many young women he had personally witnessed Epstein bring there. A shockwave of outrage reverberated across America and the globe. The public demanded Alex Acosta's resignation, but he, of course, denied all allegations, appearing almost pleased with the outcome of the case he had handled. Acosta's effrontery did not stop there. He contended that demanding his resignation was improper and unfair to the Department of Labor. Nevertheless, to save face for the sitting U.S. President Donald Trump and to preserve his own reputation, he ultimately resigned, framing it as an honorable departure, entirely unrelated to past scandals. The first court hearing for the Epstein case convened on May 15, 2019. For the first time in years, the victims had the opportunity to stand before their tormentor and articulate the thoughts they had harbored in silence. Despite Epstein's promise to immediately post $500 million for bail, the judge denied the request. The court concluded that Epstein was an exceptionally high flight risk, a finding solidified by the discovery of numerous fraudulent passports inside his home. The evidence pointed to a meticulously organized escape plan, but Judge Berman would not allow it to be set in motion. On the evening of August 10, 2019, thousands of victims received an unexpected phone call in the dead of night, informing them that Jeffrey Epstein had ended his own life in his cell. He died while facing a sentence that would have kept him imprisoned for decades. But was his death an act of repentance, or was something else at play behind the scenes? The official report from the correctional officers indicated he had fashioned a noose from a bedsheet, but it remains deeply perplexing how security at the facility could have been so compromised at that precise moment. Why did no guard patrol Epstein's containment area? Why did the security cameras malfunction on the very day of his death? A torrent of questions surfaced. A prevailing theory emerged: that Epstein had been permanently silenced by powerful, high-level figures within the establishment. Conspiracy theories ignited across social media platforms. This was fueled by the suspicion that, if his entire past were exhumed, this case would represent only a minuscule fraction of the lifestyle of the elite. Mark Epstein, Jeffrey's younger brother, distrusted the official autopsy findings and hired Dr. Michael Baden, a world-renowned forensic pathologist, to re-examine the body. According to Baden's analysis, the hyoid bone and other thin bones around Epstein's neck were completely shattered. In other words, the possibility that he caused such damage to himself by simply jumping from his bed was virtually non-existent. An immense external force must have been applied to cause those bone fragments to splinter so severely. And yet, that was not the most significant anomaly. It was later discovered that on August 8, 2019, a mere 2 days before Epstein's death, his entire fortune had been transferred to the Virgin Islands after he signed a will leaving $577 million to another party. The implication was clear and cold. His victims would receive no compensation, and Epstein demonstrated no remorse for his actions. A final question had to be asked. What would become of the lives of Epstein's victims? Maria returned to painting. She began creating satirical portraits of the individuals complicit in Epstein's network. These were the untouchables, shielded by an almost incomprehensible level of power. The survivors live on, but they live with the ghosts of their past. But as has been made clear, Epstein was not the only one with blood on his hands. A legion of real demons is still out there, and the war against this evil is far from over. The sheer cruelty of it all is paralyzing, terrifying. We are told the world is a beautiful place, a just place, worthy of our fight to protect it. But this 4-part documentary series lays bare countless shadowed corners of our society, exposing an elite class, those who appear most brilliant as the most squalid and depraved among us. In the end, how many other horrific acts did Epstein commit during his lifetime? No explanations were ever offered. All that is left is a profound sense of horror and an unsettling memory that remains with us long after. Baby. When power wears a smile, they didn't come from dark alleys. They came from mansions. They arrived with promises of opportunity, of tuition, of a better life. And that is exactly what made them so devastating. The story of Jeffrey Epstein is not just about one man. It is a mirror held up to all of us, showing what happens when wealth becomes armor, when power silences truth, and when society looks away because looking feels uncomfortable. His victims were not statistics. They were girls with dreams, girls who wanted to go to college, to make art, to build something beautiful. They were failed not once, but over and over by institutions designed to protect them. Here is what we must carry forward. Predators do not look like monsters. They look like opportunities. They study vulnerability. They offer exactly what you need, and they count on your silence. This is why we must teach our children early and clearly that no adult should make them feel unsafe, ashamed, or alone, that their voice matters, that they will be believed, and we, as a society, must demand accountability without exception regardless of wealth, title, or political connection. Justice is not a privilege reserved for the powerful. It belongs to every girl who was told her story didn't matter. It matters. It always has.